In this video, I'm going to show you something called double, or sometimes referred to as triple processing, depending on how you do it. And essentially, this is how we exposure blend a single raw file. And you might be wondering why we would do that in the first place when we can just bring down our sliders in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, like highlights here, and bring up our shadows. And that looks like we've got a pretty balanced scene. Well, the reason why we do that, the more we pull our sliders left and right, the more image degradation we get and the more chance we get of edging. The other benefit of exposure blending with a single raw file is if we bring our highlights down, look at the sky here, that's pretty good, but what if we wanted a deeper sky with more mood? Well, we can't do it. That's the maximum that we're allowed to recover the highlights. We can bring the whites down a little bit, but that actually kills the contrast in the sky. But this raw file still has more information to give. So watch this, we bring down exposure and look at how deep that sky becomes. So there is more information there for us to play with, but then of course we need to bring up our shadows even more. And again, that's finite and creates extra image degradation. So how do we get around this? Well, first things first, why don't we correct the color in this image? So I'm making it a little bit warmer there by increasing the temperature. Maybe I'm going to put in a little bit of tint, not too much, just a little bit, so plus 64. Then, as always, I will clean this image. And now back to the main page. The first thing I'm going to do is bring up my highlights because I'm pre-masking. I'm going to make sure that when we create our mask, we have a good selection of the sky. It doesn't have to be a perfect selection, but it should be a good one. So I'm bringing down the shadows, bringing up the highlights. If we want to exaggerate the sky a little bit more, we can bring up the white, but I don't want to do that. Now I'm going to hold down Shift and open image. Now in order to duplicate this layer, we don't press Command and J and Control and J. Instead, we right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy. And that creates two distinct smart objects. I'm going to call this one Bright, just so we don't get confused. And this one Dark. And I'm going to open up the dark Adobe Camera Raw. Switch to default. And then I'm going to bring our exposure down. And then of course the highlights. So we get some really deep sky in there. Now maybe I want to add a little bit more warmth to just the sky. Because remember the sky is going to come from this darker exposure. So why don't we do that? Keep adding warmth. And it was quite a warm sunrise despite this long exposure image. It looks a little bit cold, and that's because of the high-tech ND filters that I was using, which I don't really recommend, to be honest. So I'm bringing these down and I'm trying to get the sky just right. And that's the great thing about double processing, is that we can concentrate on one element for each layer. So this is just for the sky. And I think that's pretty good. Now, why don't we add a little bit of contrast in the sky too? So we can bring up clarity. And I think that looks okay. So I can press OK. Now I'm going to duplicate this bright layer again. And now we're triple processing because we're working with 3 layers. And I'm going to open that up, press default. And all we're going to do is bring this shadow slider really high so that we can show some of this information here. I mean, it doesn't really matter if that's visible in the final image. This is just so you can see the difference between triple processing and double processing. If we're double processing, then we just work with 2 exposures. If we're triple processing, we work with 3. So to blend these, it's exactly the same as we normally blend them. I'm going to choose dark and I'm going to make this visible and create a black mask because I'm going to paint on this layer. The reason why I'm doing that is because some of this sky is still visible or will be still visible in the mask. So by painting in the selection, we can reinforce that area and bring more of the dark exposure through. So with the bright exposure visible, I'm going to choose Brights 1, so a general mask. Let's see if we can get a better selection of the sky in the right using different channels. Red isn't a good option. Green's a little bit better. Blue is a very good selection. Now, I'm going to bring smoothness along just so we create more contrast between the foreground and the sky. And I'll bring range along to the left a little bit. Well, that didn't really work. So I'm going to press select with a black mask, Command and H or Control and H, and a white brush, 100% opacity. I'm going to paint the darker exposure into the base exposure. And I'm going to go over it a couple of times. So by going over it, we're taking our finger off the left mouse button and then putting it back on again. It's not just one clean sweep. So there's before and after. And that doesn't look too bad. My only concern, so I'm going to press Ctrl and D or Command and D to deselect that active selection. My only concern is that there's a little bit of glow on the left-hand side of this building, a tiny bit of white edging. So that's probably because we pulled the raw file a little bit too much in this darker exposure, which is okay because actually the sky's a little bit too dark. So I'm going to bring this highlight slider back a little bit. And you see we're removing that white edging along there. And we're still keeping the sky nicely exposed for. Press OK. I think this will look a little bit better anyway. Yeah. Okay, that's a much better final product. Now with the bright exposure, why don't we keep that invisible? Just build our mask around this base exposure here. And in fact, I'm going to call that base so we don't confuse it anymore. I'll select the brighter exposure. Open Lumi 32 and let's go for a darks 3 because we just want to select these darker areas here to the left, and that's done a pretty good job, but I'm going to bring down the range so we're more targeted just to the building to the left. And that's a little bit too much. I can amplify that a bit more, that selection, and if I'm happy with that, I can press apply. Make the darker exposure visible again. And there's before and after. And I think that looks a little bit too strong. And of course, if we don't want to affect the buildings here in front of us, we can choose a black mask and just paint that out. So there's before and after. So we've got a couple of things to do now. Namely, the most important one is correct the distortion here. So we can do that a few different ways. We can use the distort function as we've done before, or we can hold down Control, Alt, Shift and E or Command, Option, Shift and E on a Mac. And go to Filter, Adaptive Wide Angle Filter, and we can scale down a bit so we can see the whole cityscape. And now here we can select an edge that we consider to be a totally straight edge. So for example, this building. We can drag our left mouse button down along the edge of that building and hold Shift while doing so, and then let go of the mouse button. And that should have straightened that building. We can do the same here too. So the outside edge of that building, and we can pretty much work our way through the different straight edges in this cityscape. Now the thing with Dubai is a lot of buildings are strangely shaped. So sometimes we're straightening things that really aren't naturally straight. They're probably curved in real life. Like for example, this building to my left, which I've told Photoshop to straighten up. So you've got to be careful with that sort of thing. Nevertheless, I think that looks okay, but I'm going to run this along here without holding down Shift, and you'll see we've got a blue line, and that's going to try and flatten that part of the sky a little bit so we don't have to cut it out when we crop the final image. Now, as you can see, all of this has kind of become a little bit of a mess, and this can happen with the adaptive wide angle function. And it's quite easy to fix. You basically just undo what we've done and just find a few more straight lines. So for example, we could take a line all the way up the side of this building, let's say, and tell it Photoshop to straighten up that, and it would do a much better job. But there's really no end to adaptive wide angle. And the problem with it is that, I mean, it's doing a fine job here, but sometimes when you've got this many straight lines, it can make a bit of a mess of the scene, which is why I often like to just use distort. So with distort, I'm just going to zoom out first, select my exposures, right click and go to link layers, just as we've done previously. Before I use distort, I'm going to bring my ruler out here, put it around here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, not too much. Let's say about there, maybe a little bit more than that. Zoom out. There. Press Ctrl and T or Command and T, right click, choose distort. And then with this top left bit here, I'm going to move that left, and I'm trying to straighten up the outside of that building. Let me zoom into that to make sure it's okay. Now again, I don't think that this is a perfectly straight building in reality. So That's where the building ends here, going up. Actually, that's done a pretty good job as well. So I'm going to zoom out, and now we need to do the left side. Look at this building to the right. Sorry, not the left side. To the right is leaning inwards. So if I take the ruler and move that closer to, let's say, around about here, press Command and T, Control and T, distort, and then take the top right part of the image out. Maybe just up a tiny bit. Press OK. And then I can zoom into that area. And that looks okay, maybe a little bit more. And now we need to correct this building too. And I know it is a little bit of a slow process. I mean, this is the beauty of some of these new lenses and mirrorless bodies, how they correct distortion beautifully. Not necessarily perspective distortion, but barrel distortion, which saves a lot of time. So again, I'm going to press Control and T or Command and T, right click, distort, and I'm going to move that a little bit more to the right, and this a little bit more to the left. So it's a little balancing act that we've got to do here to keep this straight. And with that, let's have a look. That looks okay, not perfect. Yeah, that side's pretty straight. And to get rid of these rulers, I can choose the Move tool and just drag them off, or I can press Control and H or Command and H, and that will hide them just like it does marching ants. Now, if you're concerned when you do that, that some of the image is a little bit flat because we've pushed out the sides of the frame, which means we sometimes can squash the center of the frame, we can go back to Distort, grab this handle right in the middle, and drag it up. And that way those imposing buildings are still big and equally imposing. And just press OK. And there we have it. Now if we want, we can select this darker exposure, and we could just give it a tiny bit more depth. Now I'm just going to press the clip and mask so it doesn't affect the base exposure. So there's before and after. We could even select a photo filter, again, create a clipping mask. Look at how much warmth we're adding to that frame. We're not touching the foreground in any way with that change. I'm going to bring the opacity of that layer down, just so we have a little bit less warmth. Maybe a bit more. Now I want to add some vibrance and saturation to this whole frame because it's really lacking in color. I think we can agree. So I don't mind bringing vibrancy along quite a bit because it doesn't have an extreme effect. And saturation a little bit too, but not too much. So let's say around 13. There's before and after. And these buildings are supposed to be a little bit yellow. But nevertheless, I'm going to mask out that building to the right there. Now I'm going to go back and reduce saturation a tiny bit more there. And perhaps vibrance a little bit more. I think the sky's just got a little bit oversaturated. Okay, now with the levels adjustment, I'm going to give this scene a bit more energy. And of course, we are overexposing the sky. So with Lumi 32, I'm going to make a selection of brights 5, so the brightest parts of the sky. And I'm going to increase the range a little bit, so we select more of the sky, maybe even a little bit more. Press select with a black brush, Command and H or Control and H, and you'll see that ruler popped up. And now we can make our ants disappear, and then we just paint out the overexposed areas in the sky. Command and D or Control and D to deselect that active selection. So there's before and after. Contrast adjustment without affecting any of the highlights. And with a photo like this is probably all I would do in terms of processing. So if I just duplicate this base layer again, just as an example of what this image looked like initially. So that's the original file that we had, and I'm going to drop that down to the bottom of the pile here. So this is before and this is after. we've recovered the sky, and we've recovered the shadows in the foreground. And so this type of processing can be done with pretty much any individual raw file. Obviously, the more harsh the scene in terms of light or contrast, the harder it is going to be to restore the highlights and shadows. And the weaker the sensor in the camera, the harder it is to restore that detail as well. Nevertheless, I know a lot of people do still shoot single exposures, so this is a great technique to get as much as you can out of your raw files.